Well, good afternoon. It's the last session, speaking session, and I was wondering why they left me till the last bit. And I discovered that they have to clear the building quite soon this evening. So I think that's why I'm here. It's not a grand finale as such or whatever. It's about clearing the room very quickly. So before I go into this talk, I want to take you on my own personal learning journey. The person on the right is 10 years older than the person on the left. They're both me. And you can see that I grew into my ears. But also the 5-year-old, but now you know how old I am, right? The 5-year-old on the left was when I started school. But I left school 10 years later, so probably much sooner than many of you, in fact. My interest in organic chemistry and my innate entrepreneurial talent, think about it, meant that school wasn't really left for me, and so I was excluded. Which, in a way, was the best thing that happened to me, because I then set about unschooling myself. I would hop on a train to go into London, not pay, of course. I would go to a bookshop there called Foyle's, where my friends and I would shoplift books. Not any old books, but very heavy, thick, postgraduate type books on everything from explosives to, so we say, pharmaceutical products. I got over it. I ended up following a career of setting up fast growth, technology, entertainment, and education publishing businesses. Disrupting the very industries that wouldn't let me in. And we'll come back to that point in a while. So we're here to talk about revolution. So let's wonder, what does your revolution look like? Have you thought about revolution? We say revolution, but what does it look like on the other side? What is the new status quo? How do you see it happening? True revolutionaries know their purpose, know their objective, know their reason for existence. True revolutions transform society. Without an objective, without a goal, without a purpose, revolutions are easily diminished. So learning reimagined. This is a journey that I took over the last 2 years to explore many different schools, many different learning environments, and meet many practitioners from all over the world. Over 120,000 miles traveled, 36 cities, 6 continents, 18 countries. I met many interesting and insightful thought leaders: Noam Chomsky, Sir Ken Robinson, Seth Godin, Sugata Mitra, and to ask the question, what is school for? We don't really ask that question enough. Ivan Illich, in 1971, in his book, Deschooling Society, said school is the advertising agency which makes you believe that you need the society as it is. Here he imbues education with a certain matrix-like quality as a superstructure, along with religion and mass media and even the judicial system, to maintain the status quo. Seth Godin tells me that we're teaching to the test. Public education, he says, is 150 years old. It was designed to teach kids, to train kids to sit still at the factory, to be obedient, compliant factory workers. Today, we don't need more factory workers. We need people who can solve interesting problems, people who can lead. And yet we're not doing that. We're teaching kids to sit still and do well in the test. Noam Chomsky talks about the difference between enlightenment, i.e. learning how to learn, self-directed learning, learning for the sake of learning, learning for the joy of learning, versus indoctrination, where it's believed that young people should be put in a framework of compliance, not to challenge, of sitting tests, And then students are trapped into a lifetime of conformity as a result of debt. None of these conversations are new. These conversations aren't new. The gentleman there is John Dewey, who in 1902 wrote The Child and the Curriculum. I recommend you read it. And he talks about this two schools of thought between those who believe the curriculum, the subject matter, should drive the outcome and the means and the tests, versus another school of thought which thought it was about the self-realization of the child. I wonder whether there's a bit of a false dichotomy here. So I went traveling. They're all mine. And I want to tell you about the 6 discoveries that I found, meeting passionate educators and learners and thinkers from everywhere. And this wasn't educational tourism. It wasn't going to Singapore and Finland. I stayed in refugee camps in Syria. I went up mountains in China after an earthquake. I went into very rural India, traveling for many hours by car, to a place that had no electricity. It was media dark. I also went to the boardrooms of Silicon Valley companies and schools in America and in Europe and in Finland, of course, and Singapore. The 6 discoveries that I found were based around context, environment, engagement, technology, assessment, and the future. So context. Globalization is really the enemy of context. Globalization doesn't like context. With a McDonald's and a Starbucks on every corner, you want to homogenize. Get it as the same as possible. Get everything standardized. Makes business a lot easier. But context, we live in a world of context. It's all about context. So when I was in Ghana, in West Africa, visiting a village, primary school in a village, every child had a very basic paperwhite Kindle, Amazon Kindle. Now, wow, we live in the world of iPads. How could this possibly be transformative? Well, Ghana is a post-colonial country. When the British left in 1957, after not being able to afford to pay the maintenance, they inserted a pedagogy based around books, which they still have. There's not a literacy problem there. The kids can read. They just don't have books, printed books, because they're very expensive to import and to distribute, far more expensive than in Europe. You know, the trade tariffs and crazy stuff like that. So teachers find it very difficult to teach their lessons not knowing if the book's available. So World Reader, one of the organizations supporting these schools, provided all these children with these very simple tablets that last for a week on a battery. You could read them in broad daylight and sunshine, and each child has access to hundreds of books, and they take it home. So meanwhile, when I was in London, we were asking, well, should kids use smartphones and iPads in school? Every kid in Ghana in these primary schools were using this device. It was transformative. In India, in a media dark environment, they're using very basic feature phones to deliver interactive voice response. So my point is context. Transformation is contextual. Environment. Isn't it odd how we continue to stick to environments that are very similar to factories or offices, rows of desks and so forth? The common theme between all the schools that I visited, whether it was in Beijing or Jordan or the US or Brazil, I found environment counted. School High-Tech High in San Diego. It was very difficult to work out where the classroom ended and the common room started. The relationship between the teachers and the learners was also difficult to understand because the teachers were co-teaching, I'm afraid. Sorry. The teachers were co-teaching, which means rather than having your curriculum and your day split into subjects, it was taught through topics, through problems. So they de-siloed their learning and based their learning around problems, real-world problems that they had to solve. And you may have read recently about Finland considering an education reform to get away from siloed subjects and making topics and problems the focal point. And I've seen many schools where this has proved successful. Engagement. Stands to reason, and we hear a lot about student engagement. How do we get students engaged? We listen, we report stories, we pay attention to stories about student dropout. I think what we need to start looking at is teacher dropout, the teachers who are leaving the profession. Now, we've talked about assessment. You've heard a lot about that today, testing. But also, let's not forget, the teachers also have to fit into this system of conformity, of delivering this curriculum, of getting it tested, and so forth. No wonder teachers are leaving the profession. Only 30% of US K-12 teaching workforce feel engaged in their work. Just 30%. Leaving 2.3 million extra days off work in absenteeism, leading to a suboptimal learning environment for the children. Being deprofessionalized, de-skilled, to be converted or transferred to technicians as opposed to craftspeople. And this goes back to Frederick Taylor at the turn of the century, the scientific method, quality control. You measure the data, and then what you're trying to do is to transform craft production, i.e. doing things in a craft of teaching, into mass production. Since when did teaching become a delivery system? It's not FedEx. That's a reductive approach from Silicon Valley. So technology. Now, 30 years ago, when I first started getting involved in educational technology, I believed it would profoundly change education. 30 years later, I'm still waiting. It's had very little impact, in fact, on our education systems, despite all the things that we know these devices are capable of doing, and the fluency and what kids do outside of school. So what is happening here? We're also at a bit of a crossroads. We're at a crossroads that says we can use this technology in an industrialized education system to impart the knowledge, to assess the kids. So if we use that 19th century pedagogy, that 19th century approach to teaching, and we just digitize that, is that technology? Can we get rid of the teachers? Now, that's not what I signed up for. Because technology used in that way in education is a bit like those conveyor belts that carry you in an airport. You can go slowly, but you'll get to the end, or you can go fast, but you still get to the same place. And that's what these systems are about. Now, I'm not anti-technology. I've made my living from technology. What I'm anti is education being viewed in a reductionist form, that we only measure what we can measure and nothing else counts. We only reward teachers on the basis of the test. And if we start using technology for that, and we start using big data and analytics and adaptive learning, and leaving teaching to the computer, we will impoverish the learning of generations to come. However, we can, of course, use technology to amplify learning and amplify teaching. Just be aware about how we're using technology in the classroom. And I've seen different versions of this. Teachers won't be replaced by computers, by technology, but agile teachers who do use technology will replace them, the ones that don't. So it's important, obviously, for teaching staff to become literate in these new technologies. But teaching cannot be reduced to data, to algorithms, to software. It doesn't work like that. Teaching isn't only about that. It's not about only importing knowledge and then testing it. Whole much more. I mean, a lot of teachers I know in this audience, I hope will agree with me. And also, education plus technology does not equal transformation. It does not equal revolution. Technology can just as equally enslave, as we've seen happen in the Snowden revelations. For example, we're algorithmic cultures where we leave learning to algorithms and software. So assessment, this homogenizing test at the end, the quality control standard in the factory. This is the tail that wags the dog of learning. We measure what we can measure. We have standardized output. Let's not forget assessment is a business. It's a billion-dollar business. There are vested interests in maintaining assessment. The conversation around assessment and testing doesn't happen in a neutral space. There's no neutral kind of Switzerland where this can happen. It's conducted with government advised by business, people who own the content, people who own the exams. Not a neutral space. And so when we talk about removing assessment or having different kinds of assessment, what we hear are companies that rather than having less assessment, they want to have more expensive assessment, more complex assessment. And we're already seeing that in the work of OECD with their unelected Olympic Committee of Learning. The revolution, in my opinion, in education has to begin with assessment. Until the industry of assessment has been disrupted, we won't have a revolution. I've sat on so many summits where someone stood on the stage and told me the future. It's self-driving cars, every kid needs a code, it's all digital, etc., etc., etc. But the reality is, we don't know what the future looks like. We don't know. The future is also determined by us. We have something called agency. Just because we have the technological determinists from Silicon Valley telling us we need all these skills, unemployment, let's get everyone digital, doesn't mean it's true. We, as a society, as revolutionaries, make those decisions. What we do know about the future, what we do know for definite, what's going to happen this century with our children and their children, we know that population will reach 11 billion people. Think about that, 11 billion people. The continent of Africa will be 4 billion people. We know that climate change is a thing. Put those things together. The majority of that population increase will happen around the equator. They are going to want to move. How is that going to happen? We know that's an issue this century. We know antibiotic resistance is a thing. So whoever's doing this constellation of issues has a bit of a sense of humor. Population, climate change, disease, and then ideology. Now, it doesn't have to be, thank you. It doesn't have to be dystopian. It can just as easily, because we know the challenges, we can set these challenges in our education systems. We can do that now. This could be the revolution. But if we continue to use gross domestic product as our key performance indicator for education, this global competitiveness, I don't think we're going to get very far. We have to lift these problems together, these challenges together as a global society. And this is the connected society that I'm talking about in my book. Of course, education is a passport to a better life. But who controls the borders? Are we just swapping our national borders for corporate borders? Are the new borders, Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, are they the new borders? We make the decision about what happens next in our revolution. We decide what is the next status quo, what is the new status quo going to be? And if we think about that and embed that in our thinking in education systems, we start thinking about what the purpose of education could be. And so then, I think the purpose of education is to equip our children with the skills to reimagine society. This is not a revolution in education, it's a revolution in society. So they can meet the challenges of their generation. And if I'm wrong, and they build a better world for nothing, so what? Thank you.